Today I'm gonna read about the culture map again. So started from the 18th page. Um, how did my country get placed there? Each of the following chapters is devoted to one of the 8 culture map scales. Each scale's positions 20 to 30 countries countries along a continuum and guides you in applying the scale to dozens of situations commonly arising in a global business world. Because what is important on the scale is rela- relative gap between two countries. Someone from any country on the map can apply the book's concepts to their interactions with colleges from any other country. Some may object that these scales don't give adequate weight to cultural variations among individuals, subcultures, subcultures, regions, and organizations. Understanding how the scales were created may help you to see how such variations are reflected in the scales, as well as how you can most accurately apply the insights that the scale provide. As an example, let's look at the placements of Germany on the scheduling scale, which reflects how people in various cultures tend to manage time. The first step is interviewing mid-level German managers, asking them to speak about the importance of being flexible versus organized when it comes to scheduling meetings, projects, or timelines. Of course, individual response vary, but a normative, normative patterns emerges. A bell curve illustrates the range of what is considered appropriate and acceptable business behavior on the schedule scale in the German, with the hump where the majority of responsibles are responsible. It might look like this. Of course, there are probably a few outliers, a handful of Germans who fall to the right or the left of the hump, but their behavior, judging by the average German's opinion, would be considered inappropriate, unacceptable, or at least not ideal in German business culture. It was through this type of analysis that I began to map the country positions on each scale. The later adjust the positions based on feedback from hundreds of international executives. When you look at the scales depicted in this book, you won't see the hump for each country but simply a point representing the normative position of the hump, as shown in Figure 1.3. In other words, the country positions on the scale indicates the middle positions of a range of acceptable or appropriate behaviors in that country. When you look at the scales, it keep in mind that both cultural differences and individual differences impact each international interaction. Within the range of the acceptable business behaviors in a given culture, an individual business person will make choices in a particular situations. For example, consider the evaluating scales, see Chapter 2, which deals with whether it is better to be direct or indirect when giving negative feedback. There is a range of acceptable ways to give negative feedback in the Netherlands, and a Dutch business person can comfortably make a choice that falls anywhere within that range. Similarly, there is a range of the appropriate ways to give negative feedback in the United Kingdom, and the British businessman can choose a specific approach from any place within that range. See Figure 1.4. The culture sets a range, and within that range, each individual makes a choice. It is not the questions of culture or personality, but of culture and personality. If you compare two cultures, you may find that portions of their ranges overlap, while other portions do not. So some Dutch people might employ feedback styles that are appropriate in the Netherlands as well as in the United Kingdom, while others may use techniques that seems acceptable in Netherlands but would be considered inappropriate, blunt, and offensive in the United Kingdom. The 8 scales can help you understand such differences and evaluate individual choices within a broad cultural context. The crucial perspective, cultural relativity. Another crucial factor in understanding the meaning of the eight scales is the concept of the cultural relativity. For example, let's consider the location of Spain on the trusting scale, figure 1.5, which positions cultures according to whether they build trust based on the relationships or on experience of shared tasks. Now, ask yourself a simple question. Is Spain task-based or relationship-based? If you're like most people, you'd answer that Spain is the relationship-based, but this answer is subtly, yet crucially wrong. The correct answer is that if you come from France, the United Kingdom, Sweden, the United States, or any other culture that falls to the left of Spain on the scale, then Spain is relationship based in the comparison to your own culture. However, if you come from India, Saudi Arabia, Angola, or China, then Spain is very task-based indeed, again in comparison to your own culture. The point here is that when it's examining how people from different cultures relate to one another, what matters is not the absolutely positions of either culture on the scale, but rather the relative positions of the two cultures. It is this relative positioning that determines how people view one another. For example, consider what happens when the British consulting group KPMG created several global teams to stabilize standardize the implementations of management software systems developed by enterprise software developer SAP. One global team was composed primarily of British and French consultants, and throughout their work, the British complained that the French were disorganized, chaotic, and lacked punctuality. They take so many tangents and side routes during the meetings. It's impossible to follow their line of thinking, one British team member said. Another team made up of mainly Indian and French, the Indians complained that the French were rigid, inflexible, and obsessed with deadlines and structure to the point that they were unable to adapt as the situations around them changed. If you don't tell them weeks in advance what is going to happen in the meeting, in which order, it makes them very nervous. One Indian team member said, "Why such contradictory perceptions of the French team members?" A quick glance at the scheduling scale, figure 1.6, shows that the French fall between the British and the Indian, leading to opposite perceptions from those two outlined perspectives. When I described this experience to a group of Germans and British collaborating on another global team, one of the Germans laughed. "They're very funny," he told us, because we Germans always complain that the British are disorganized, chaotic, and always late. Exactly the complaints the British in your example lodged against the French. Note the relative positions of the Germans and British on the scheduling scale. So, cultural relativity is the key to understand the impact of culture on human interactions. If an executive wants to build and manage global teams that can work together successfully, he needs to understand not just how people from his own culture experience people from various international cultures, but also how those international cultures perceive one another. When cultural differences are inside us. Recently, I had occasion to place a phone call to Cosimo Turotero, who runs a speakers association based in London. Simply on the basis of his name, I assumed before the call that he was Italian, but as soon as he spoke, starting sentences with the German "yeah," it was clearly that he was not. Turo explained, "My mother was Sylvian, my father was Italian. I was raised largely in Germany, although I have spent most of my adult life in the UK. So you see, these cultural differences that you talk about, I don't need to speak to anyone else in order to experience them. I have all of these challenges right inside myself." I laughed, imagining the Tortoro having breakfast alone and saying to himself in Italia, "Why do you have to be so blunt?" and responding to himself in German, "Me blunt? Why do you have to be so emotional?" While most people spend most of their lives in their native lands, the skills in this book have an extra level of interest for those with more heterogeneous backgrounds. If you lived in the two or more countries or have parents from the different countries, you may begin to notice how multiple cultures have helped to shape your personality. You may find that part of your personal style comes from the culture where you spent the first years of your life, another from the culture where you attended college and held your first job, another from your father's culture, and still another from your mother's culture. The following pages may not only help you become more effective as a business person, they may even help you to understand yourself more fully than ever before. Testing the water you swim in. Tasting the water you swim in. A culture can be a sensitive topic. Speaking about a person's culture often provokes the same type of reactions as speaking about his mother. Most of them have a deep protection instinct from the culture we consider our own, and though we may criticize it bitterly ourselves, we may become easily incensed if someone from outside the culture dares to do so. So for this reason, I'm walking a minefield in this book. I promise that all the situations I recount are drawn from the stories of real people working in the real companies. Though though I've changed names, details, and circumstances to maintain um, anonymity, nonetheless, you may find yourself reacting defensively when you hear what others have said about the culture you call your own. It isn't true. My culture is not the bit like that. At the risk of the pouring oil on the fire, allow me to repeat the familiar story of the two young fish who encounter an older fish swimming in the opposite way. He nods that at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" which prompts one of the young fish to ask the other, "What the hell is water?" When you're in and of a culture, as a fish are in and of water, it is often difficult or even impossible to see that culture. Often, people who have spent their lives living in one culture see only regional and individual differences and therefore conclude my national culture does not have a clear character. John Cleary, an engineer from the United States, explained this phenomenon during one of my courses for executives. The first 28 years of my life I lived in the smallish town of Madison, Wisconsin, but in my work I traveled across the U.S. weekly since my team members were scattered across this country. The regional differences in the U.S. are strong. The New York City feels entirely different than Athens, Georgia, so when I began working with the foreigners who speak of what it was like to work with Americans, I saw that as a sign of ignorance. I would respond, there is no American culture. The reasons are different, and within the reasons, Every individual is different. But then I moved to New Delhi, India. I began leading an Indian team and overseeing their collaborations with my former team in the US. I was very excited, thinking this would be more opportunity to learn about Indian culture. When 16 months in New Delhi, working with Indians and seeing these collaborations from the Indian viewpoint, I can report that I have learned a tremendous amount about my own culture. As I view the American way of thinking and working and acting from this outside perspective, for the first time I see a clear visual American culture. The culture of my country has strong character that was totally invisible to me when I was in it and part of it. When you hear when you hear the people quotes in this book complain, criticize, or gasp at your culture from their perspective, try not to take it as a personal affront. Instead, think of it as the opportunity to learn more, not just about the unfamiliar cultures of this world, but also about your own. Trying seeing, feeling, tasting the water you swim in the way a land animal might perceive it. You may find the experience fascinating and mind expanding. When I arrived back in my apartment in Paris after the session with the Bernas and Bochan, I thought back to the advice from Bo's mother. I googled her name. You have two eyes, two ears, and one mouth, and you should use them accordingly. Expecting the quotations to begin with that Confucius says, or at least Bo's mother says, no such luck. The ancient Greek philosophy Epictetus seems to have said something similar, but as far as I know, he never lived in China. That night, instead of dreaming about the fruits disappearing from my shopping cart, I lay in bed thinking about why Bo Chan didn't speak up and why I kept speaking in the face of his silence. While irony of ironies, I was running a session on cross-cultural effectiveness. I thought again about the Mrs. Chan's advice and wished that I had followed her suggestions that morning. Mrs. Chan's advice is sound, not just for Chinese children, but also for all of us who hope to improve our effectiveness working across cultural barriers. When interacting with someone from another culture, try to watch more, listen more, and speak less. Listen before you speak and learn before you act. Before picking up the phone to negotiate it with your suppliers in China, your outsourcing team in India, your new boss in Brazil, or new clients in Russia. Use all the available resources to understand how the cultural framework you are working with is different from your own, and only then react. 19쪽부터 27쪽까지 읽었고요. 이렇게 해서 Introduction: Negotiating the cultural differences and the wisdom of Mrs. Chun. 네, 읽었습니다. So now is the chapter 2. Chapter 1, listening to the air, communicating across cultures. It starts from the page 29. So I will read it later.